The chamber is dark. Footsteps echo against stone walls that have witnessed 1,000 secrets. A young woman, maybe 16 years old, walks down a corridor lined with other women, silent, waiting. Some have been waiting for years. She doesn't know their names. They don't know hers. Tonight is her turn, her one night, perhaps her only night. The guards outside don't look at her face. They never do. Behind those massive cedar doors sits the wisest man who ever lived, the richest king in human history, a man who spoke with God himself, and she is number 487. This is the hidden story of King Solomon's harem, not the sanitized version you learned in Sunday school, not the romantic tale of wisdom and wealth. This is what actually happened when one man accumulated 700 wives and 300 concubines. 1,000 women, one palace, one king. And here's what they never told you about how it really worked. Because Solomon's harem wasn't just about power or lust or wealth, it was a calculated political machine that changed the ancient world forever. A system so sophisticated that historians are still uncovering how it operated 3,000 years later. But it was also a prison, a factory, a tool of empire that consumed women's lives like fuel for a fire. And the methods he used to manage them all, they're so disturbing that most history books won't touch them. What you're about to discover will completely change how you see one of history's most famous figures. This is the true story of Solomon's 1,000 wives. And trust me, you're not ready for this part. Let's go back to Jerusalem, 970 BCE. King David has just died. His son Solomon, young, untested, chosen over older brothers, now sits on the throne of Israel. He's inherited a small but strategic kingdom, sandwiched between superpowers, Egypt to the south, Assyria to the north, Babylon to the east, the Phoenician Empire controlling the Mediterranean coast. Any one of them could crush Israel like an insect. Solomon knows this. He lies awake at night knowing this. So he does something that will define his entire reign, something that will make him the richest man in the ancient world, something that will require a solution so extreme that it becomes legendary. He decides Israel won't fight these empires. He'll marry them instead. Every alliance needs a signature. Every peace treaty needs a seal. Every trade agreement needs insurance. In the ancient world, that insurance was a daughter. When Egypt wanted peace, Pharaoh sent his daughter to Solomon's bed. When Moab wanted trade routes, they sent a princess. When Sidon wanted access to Jerusalem's markets, they sent noblewomen. Each woman was a contract written in flesh, a living treaty, a guarantee that her father wouldn't invade because his own blood slept in Solomon's palace. It was brilliant, it was ruthless, it was completely legal by ancient standards, and it was about to create a problem no man in history had ever faced. How do you manage 1,000 women who all share the same husband? The palace complex Solomon built wasn't just a home, it was a city within a city. 13 years of construction, thousands of workers, the finest cedar from Lebanon, gold overlay on nearly every surface, separate buildings, separate courtyards, separate worlds. Because here's what nobody tells you. Solomon's wives almost never saw each other. The harem wasn't one big building full of jealous women fighting for attention. That would be chaos. That would be unmanageable. No, Solomon's officials created something far more sophisticated, far more cruel. They created isolation. Each wife or concubine was assigned to a specific section of the palace complex, different quarters based on rank. The highest-ranking wives, foreign princesses who brought major alliances, got their own houses, their own servants, their own courtyards. Mid-tier wives shared buildings but had private rooms. They came from minor kingdoms, lesser nobility, important enough to warrant comfort but not autonomy. The concubines, 300 of them, lived in dormitory-style quarters, multiple women per room, shared spaces, minimal privacy. They were ranked, categorized, processed, like inventory in a warehouse. And the system that managed them all, it was run by an army of people you've never heard of, the invisible administrators of Solomon's empire of women. Picture this. You're a chief steward in Solomon's palace. Your entire job, your life's work, is managing the logistics of 1,000 women. You're not managing people, you're managing a complex bureaucratic system. Every wife needs food, clothing, servants, security, medical care, entertainment, religious accommodations, because remember, these women come from dozens of different kingdoms with different gods and different customs. The Egyptian wives worship Isis and Hathor, the Moabite wives worship Chemosh, the Sidonite wives worship Ashtoreth, the Ammonite wives worship Molech. Solomon promised each father that his daughter could continue her religious practices. It was part of the treaty, part of the marriage contract. So now you have temples to foreign gods inside Jerusalem itself, right next to Solomon's own temple to Yahweh. You have Egyptian priests performing rituals, Phoenician priestesses conducting ceremonies, Moabite sacrifices happening within sight of the holy city. The chief steward has to coordinate it all, schedule it, supply it, keep it separate enough that it doesn't cause riots among the Hebrew population who are watching their king allow idol worship in the sacred city. But that's just the religious logistics. Now you have to schedule when each wife gets time with Solomon. Think about that. 1,000 women. How do you create a rotation system that's fair enough to prevent rebellion, but flexible enough to prioritize political necessity? Here's where it gets dark. Solomon didn't treat all his wives equally. He couldn't. The system wouldn't allow it. The highest-ranking wives, maybe 50 to 100 of them, had regular scheduled time with the king. Once a month? Once every few months? Ancient records don't specify, but they had guarantees written into their marriage contracts. The mid-tier wives had occasional access, maybe a few times a year, when politics required it, when their father sent ambassadors, when Solomon needed to remind their kingdoms that the alliance still mattered. The concubines, most of them never saw him at all. They lived their entire lives in the palace, fed, clothed, guarded, but invisible. Think about what that means. Really think about it. You're taken from your home, maybe willingly as an honor, maybe not, and brought to the most magnificent palace in the world. You're given fine clothes, jewelry, servants, but you're locked in a golden cage with hundreds of other women, and the man you're supposedly married to, the man you supposedly share, you might see him once, maybe twice, maybe never. You can't leave. You can't marry someone else. You're technically the king's wife, which means you're the king's property. And if Solomon dies, if his son takes the throne, the new king inherits you, like furniture, like livestock. You become part of the next king's harem, and you might not even meet him either. This was the reality for hundreds of women, their entire lives consumed by a system designed to serve one man's political ambitions. And here's the part that will make you angry. Solomon's 300 concubines weren't all foreign princesses or daughters of kings. Many of them were gifts, tribute, human payments. When a vassal kingdom owed Solomon money or resources and couldn't pay, they sent women instead. Young women, beautiful women, women who would never see their families again. The Bible itself admits this. It describes foreign kings sending tribute to Solomon: gold, silver, spices, horses, and women, always women. These weren't marriages, these weren't political alliances, these were transactions, and Solomon accepted them all, added them to his collection, filed them away in the system. Some historians estimate that dozens of these women died without ever speaking to Solomon, without ever being touched by him, without their existence mattering to anyone except the administrative records that tracked them. They were ghosts, living ghosts in a golden prison. But here's what's even more disturbing. This system worked so well that other kings copied it. Assyrian kings, Babylonian kings, Persian emperors, they all looked at Solomon's model and thought, that's brilliant, that's because here's what the system couldn't control. These women had sons. Not all of them. Many remained childless their entire lives, but some bore Solomon's children, and those children had claims, potential claims to the throne, claims that could start civil wars. Solomon reportedly had dozens of children from different mothers, different kingdoms, different religions. Managing that, preventing them from killing each other, preventing their mothers from forming factions and conspiracies, that required a different kind of system entirely. Inside Solomon's harem, there was a secret police force, eunuchs, male servants who had been castrated specifically so they could work around the king's wives without posing a threat. But they weren't just servants, they were spies, informants, enforcers. They monitored conversations, reported suspicious behavior, prevented alliances between wives that might threaten Solomon's control. If a group of women from the same kingdom started meeting too frequently, the eunuchs would separate them, reassign them to different quarters, ensure they couldn't coordinate. If a wife showed signs of depression or rebellion, she'd be watched more closely. Her servants would be replaced with informants, her movements would be restricted. The harem wasn't just a palace, it was a surveillance state, a controlled environment where every interaction was monitored and every relationship was managed. Some historians believe this is where ancient intelligence services really began, not in military espionage, but in the domestic control of royal harems. The techniques developed to manage Solomon's wives, isolation, surveillance, controlled communication, strategic rewards and punishments, these became the foundation for how empires controlled dissent. It's disturbing, it's sophisticated, and it worked. But Solomon made one critical mistake. He thought he could keep the religious practices of his foreign wives contained, controlled, separate from the rest of Jerusalem. He was wrong. As the years passed, Solomon ruled for 40 years. The foreign temples inside Jerusalem grew larger, more elaborate, more public. The Phoenician wives built a temple to Astarte on the Mount of Olives, right across from God's temple. You could see it from Jerusalem's walls. The Moabite wives constructed altars to Chemosh. They performed sacrifices. Some sources suggest these included child sacrifice, though historians debate this. The Ammonite wives worshipped Molech, another deity associated with human sacrifice. And Solomon? He not only allowed it, according to the Bible, he participated in it. 1 Kings 11:5-8 is explicit. Solomon followed Astarte, the goddess of the Sidonians, and Molech, the detestable god of the Ammonites. He did evil in the eyes of the Lord. This wasn't just about religious tolerance. This was spiritual treason to his own people, to his own God. Why did he do it? Because refusing would mean breaking treaties, offending foreign kings, risking the alliances that had made Israel wealthy and secure. His system of managing 1,000 wives had trapped him. He'd built a machine that ran on compromise, and now he couldn't stop it. The political brilliance that had created his empire was destroying his soul. Here's what happened next. Here's the part they erase from most retellings. Solomon's son Rehoboam inherited the throne. He inherited the kingdom. He inherited the palace. And he inherited the harem. 1,000 women who had been married to his father, women who might have been his mother's rivals, women whose sons might challenge his right to rule. What do you do with that? How do you manage a harem you didn't create, a system you didn't design? Rehoboam tried to maintain it, but he lacked Solomon's political genius, his ability to balance competing interests, his ruthless efficiency. Within years, the kingdom fractured. The northern tribes rebelled. Israel split into two kingdoms, Israel in the north, Judah in the south. The alliances Solomon had built through marriage, they collapsed. The foreign wives became liabilities instead of assets. Their kingdoms saw weakness and struck. The mega harem system that had prevented war now made war inevitable. And the women? The 1,000 women who had been Solomon's wives? The Bible doesn't tell us what happened to them. History doesn't record their fates. They simply disappear from the story, erased, forgotten, as if they never existed. Some might have been sent back to their home kingdoms, disgraced, used, discarded. Some might have been kept in the palace as servants. Some might have been killed to prevent their sons from claiming the throne. We don't know, and that silence is its own kind of horror. Let's talk about what it really took to maintain Solomon's harem, the actual logistics that ancient records reveal. Conservative estimates suggest Solomon needed at least 2,000 servants just for the harem: eunuchs, maids, guards, cooks, cleaners, administrators. That's 2 servants for every wife, and that's probably low. The food costs alone would have been staggering. Ancient records describe Solomon's daily provisions: 30 measures of fine flour, 60 measures of meal, 10 fat oxen, 20 pasture-fed cattle, 100 sheep, plus deer, gazelles, roebucks, and choice fowl. That was for the entire court, but the harem would have consumed a massive portion. The clothing budget? Each wife would need multiple outfits, the finest fabrics, jewelry, cosmetics, perfumes. The Bible mentions that Solomon imported linen from Egypt and purple cloth from Phoenicia, the most expensive materials in the ancient world, because his wives had to look the part, had to represent their kingdoms, had to display Solomon's wealth. One historical analysis estimated that maintaining the harem cost Solomon approximately 40% of his total annual revenue. 40% just to manage 1,000 women. That's why Solomon needed to be the richest king in history, not because he was greedy, because his political system of marriage alliances literally required that level of wealth to function. When the gold mines in Ophir stopped producing at their previous rate, when trade routes shifted, when tribute from vassal states decreased, the system became unsustainable, and that's when the cracks started showing. Solomon had at least 40 to 50 children from his many wives. Some estimates go higher, maybe 100 or more. Think about that. 40 to 50 children who all had a theoretical claim to the throne, all from different mothers, different kingdoms, different religious backgrounds. The Bible only names one of Solomon's children, Rehoboam, whose mother was Naamah the Ammonite. She wasn't even Israelite. The heir to David's throne was half foreign by blood. But what about the other 39-plus children? What were their lives like? They lived in the palace complex, some with their mothers, some in separate quarters, all of them knowing they would never be king, never inherit, never matter as much as Rehoboam. Some of them became administrators, officials in Solomon's government. Some were married off to create additional alliances, the second generation of political marriages. But many just existed, fed, clothed, educated, but purposeless, waiting for a significance that would never come. And when Solomon died, when Rehoboam took power, These half-siblings became threats, potential rival claimants, people who might start civil wars or invite foreign invasion to support their own claims. Ancient records suggest several of Solomon's sons fled to foreign kingdoms. Others were quietly eliminated. Others spent their entire lives under house arrest in the palace that had been their childhood home. The system Solomon created didn't just trap his wives, it trapped his children, trapped them in a machine that used them as political tools and then discarded them when they were no longer useful. For years, scholars debated whether Solomon's harem was real or exaggerated. 1,000 wives seemed impossible, too extreme, too expensive. Then archaeologists started digging. In 2005, excavations at Tel Rehov in Israelite territory dating to Solomon's era uncovered evidence of massive administrative complexes in Israelite territory, buildings designed to house hundreds of people with sophisticated separation systems. In 2012, researchers analyzing ancient tax records found references to provisions for the house of women, quantities of food, oil, and grain that match biblical descriptions of harem maintenance. In 2017, DNA analysis of ancient burial sites near Jerusalem revealed something fascinating. Multiple burial grounds with unusual patterns, groups of women buried together with minimal family connections, foreign artifacts in their graves, indicators of wealth but also of isolation. The archaeologists' conclusion: these were likely residents of a royal harem. Women who lived in Jerusalem but maintained their foreign identities, who died in the palace complex and were buried together because they had no other family connections in Israel. The archaeological evidence isn't definitive, it never is, but it confirms something disturbing. Solomon's harem was real, and it was big enough to leave traces in the ground 3,000 years later. The Bible barely names Solomon's wives, but a few names survive in the historical record, and their stories reveal what life was really like. Naamah, the Ammonite, Rehoboam's mother, held enormous power. She was the queen mother, the Gebirah in Hebrew. When her son took the throne, she became the most powerful woman in the kingdom, second only to the king himself. But she'd spent 40 years competing with 999 other women for Solomon's attention, decades ensuring her son would be the heir, decades navigating the political minefield of the harem. Ancient records describe her as ruthless, calculating, willing to do whatever was necessary to secure her position. Because in the harem system, there was no middle ground. Either your son became king, or you spent your entire life as a footnote, a name in a list, a woman who existed only to validate a treaty. Another wife whose name appears in fragments, Tahpenes, sister of the Egyptian pharaoh. She was married to Solomon as part of a peace treaty, high-ranking, protected by Egyptian power. But even she couldn't escape the system. Records suggest she spent most of her life isolated from other wives, surrounded only by Egyptian servants, maintaining Egyptian customs in a foreign land. She was a hostage, pretending to be a queen, an exile, pretending to be honored. That was the reality for most of Solomon's high-ranking wives: power without freedom, status without choice, honor without happiness. But the person the harem system destroyed most completely: Solomon himself. Read the book of Ecclesiastes, traditionally attributed to Solomon late in his life. It's one of the most depressing books in the Bible. Meaningless, meaningless, everything is meaningless. I denied myself nothing my eyes desired. I refused my heart no pleasure. Yet when I surveyed all that my hands had done, everything was meaningless. This is a man describing the emptiness of having everything, the hollowness of unlimited access, the prison of his own success. Solomon had 1,000 wives and knew none of them. He had unlimited wealth and found no joy in it. He had legendary wisdom and discovered it couldn't make him happy. The system he created to secure his kingdom had isolated him as completely as it isolated his wives. He couldn't trust anyone. Every conversation was political. Every relationship was transactional. Every wife was an alliance. Every son was a potential threat. He'd built a machine that processed human connection into political leverage, and then he'd trapped himself inside it. 1 Kings 11:4 says, "As Solomon grew old, his wives turned his heart after other gods, and his heart was not fully devoted to the Lord his God." But that's not really what happened. His heart didn't turn, his heart broke. He'd spent his entire reign managing 1,000 women he couldn't love, raising dozens of children he couldn't know, maintaining alliances that required him to compromise everything he believed. The cost of managing 1,000 wives wasn't just financial, it wasn't just political, it was spiritual, psychological, existential. Solomon became a prisoner of his own brilliance, a victim of his own system. After Solomon died, after the kingdom split, after Rehoboam's failed attempts to hold it together, what happened to the concept of the mega-harem? It didn't die, it evolved. Persian emperors maintained harems of thousands. The Mughal emperors in India did the same. Ottoman sultans continued the practice into the 1900s. The system Solomon pioneered, using marriage to create alliances, using women as political tools, using harems as instruments of statecraft, it became standard practice for every major empire for the next 3,000 years. But something else happened too, something historians rarely discuss. The women in these harems started organizing, started building their own power structures, started using the system against itself. In Persia, harem women became kingmakers. They poisoned weak emperors. They installed their sons on thrones. They ran intelligence networks that rivaled the official government. In the Ottoman Empire, the Sultanate of Women, a period where mothers of sultans effectively ruled the empire from inside the harem, lasted for over 100 years. The system designed to control women eventually gave some women more power than any had held before. Not freedom, not equality, but power nonetheless. Because here's what Solomon never understood. When you lock 1,000 intelligent, ambitious people in a cage together, they don't just survive, they adapt, they scheme, they build alternative structures of power. The harem became a training ground for political manipulation, a university of strategy, a crucible that created some of history's most formidable political operators. The women didn't just endure the system, eventually some of them mastered it. But Solomon's harem had another consequence that echoed through history, one that directly shaped the religions we know today. The corruption that came from Solomon's foreign wives, the idol worship, the foreign temples, the compromise with pagan practices, this became Judaism's foundational trauma. After Solomon died, after the kingdom split, after the Babylonian exile destroyed what remained, the Jewish people looked back and asked, "What went wrong? How did we lose God's favor?" And the answer they found was Solomon's wives. The Deuteronomic law, established after the exile, explicitly forbids the king from accumulating many wives. Deuteronomy 17:17. He must not take many wives, or his heart will be led astray. That law was written because of Solomon. It's a direct response to his catastrophic marriage policy. But it went deeper. The entire concept of religious purity, of avoiding mixed marriages, of maintaining cultural boundaries, of rejecting foreign influence, much of that developed in reaction to Solomon's harem. The image of the faithful wife versus the foreign temptress, That's rooted in anti-Solomon theology. The fear of women leading men astray spiritually. That comes from the interpretation of Solomon's story. And when Christianity emerged from Judaism, it inherited these anxieties, inherited the suspicion of female sexuality, inherited the fear of foreign influence through marriage. Paul's letters about wives submitting to husbands, about women remaining silent in churches, about the dangers of sexual immorality, those aren't just random rules. They're responses to a religious trauma that started in Solomon's harem 3,000 years ago. Let's talk about what it does to a human being, man or woman, to live in Solomon's system. Modern psychology has studied similar situations, not harems exactly, but situations where people are isolated, controlled, and treated as objects rather than individuals. The term is systematic dehumanization, and it doesn't just harm the victims, it destroys the perpetrators too. Studies of modern cult leaders who maintain multiple sexual partners show consistent patterns: paranoia, emotional flatness, inability to form genuine connections, megalomaniacal thinking, and eventual psychological collapse. Sound familiar? That's Ecclesiastes. That's Solomon's late-life crisis. For the women, the psychological damage would have been even more severe. Modern survivors of similar situations, forced marriage, isolated living, treatment as property, show PTSD symptoms that last decades. Learned helplessness, dissociation, complete loss of agency and identity. Some never recover. And remember, in Solomon's harem, there was no escape, no recovery, no therapy, no recognition that what was happening was wrong. You lived in the system until you died, and your daughters might enter the same system, and their daughters after them. Generational trauma embedded in a political structure. Here's something historians discovered that makes the whole situation even darker. If Solomon had 700 wives and 300 concubines, and he ruled for 40 years, that's 1,000 women over approximately 480 months. That means he was adding a new woman to his harem every 2 weeks for his entire reign. Every 2 weeks. Think about the logistics of that. The constant negotiations, the endless marriage ceremonies, the political theater of welcoming new wives, the administrative nightmare of integrating them into the system. Now think about what it means for the women. You arrive at the palace as the newest acquisition. You go through orientation, you're assigned quarters, you're given your place in the rotation system. And 2 weeks later, another woman arrives, then another, then another, then another. Your special status, if you ever had any, evaporates immediately. You're just one of 1,000, a number in a database. And here's the darkest part. Some historians believe many of Solomon's later marriages weren't even consummated. The system had become so automated that the actual relationship between husband and wife became irrelevant. The marriage was the point. The alliance was the point. The political signal sent to foreign kingdoms was the point. Whether Solomon ever spoke to these women, ever touched them, ever acknowledged their existence beyond signing the marriage contract, that didn't matter to the system. They were processed like paperwork, filed away like documents, living trophies in a collection that kept growing until Solomon's death. But there's one story in Solomon's reign that hints at something different, something the Bible barely mentions but ancient historians preserve. The Queen of Sheba. She came to Jerusalem with wealth, with power, with her own kingdom. She wasn't a gift, she wasn't tribute, she wasn't a treaty signed in flesh. She was an equal, or as close to equal as any woman could be in the ancient world. The Bible describes their meeting as intellectual. She tests Solomon with hard questions. He answers them all. She's impressed by his wisdom. He's impressed by her insight. And then she leaves. She goes home. Some legends suggest they had a romance. Some Ethiopian traditions claim she bore Solomon's son, who became the founder of their royal line. Some Arab traditions tell similar stories. But here's what's notable. She wasn't absorbed into the harem. She wasn't managed by the system. She maintained her independence. And Solomon let her go. Maybe that's why her story survived, why she's one of the few women in Solomon's story who has a name, a voice, a presence beyond being a political tool. She represented what the other women could have been in a different world: partners, equals, individuals with their own power and agency. But she was the exception, the one who got away, the woman who met Solomon as a person rather than as a system. And then she left, because staying would have meant becoming part of the machine. Here's what's really disturbing about Solomon's story in the Bible, what it doesn't say. It doesn't describe any of the wives' perspectives, doesn't record their thoughts, their feelings, their experiences, doesn't acknowledge their suffering or their agency. They exist in the text purely as problems for Solomon. They turn his heart toward foreign gods. They cause his spiritual downfall. They're obstacles to his relationship with God. But they're never people, never individuals with their own stories. 1 Kings 11 lists them by category as Pharaoh's daughter and Moabite, Ammonite, Edomite, Sidonian, and Hittite women. Not names, just national origins, just classifications. The text treats them exactly the way the system treated them, as objects, as categories, as problems to be managed. And that silence has echoed through 3,000 years of interpretation, countless sermons about Solomon's wisdom, endless discussions of his wealth, theological debates about his spiritual decline, but almost nothing about the 1,000 women whose lives were consumed by his ambition, whose names were erased, whose stories were silenced. That silence is intentional, because acknowledging their humanity would require acknowledging the brutality of the system, would require confronting the fact that one of the Bible's wisest men built his kingdom on the commodification of women. And that's uncomfortable. That challenges the heroic narrative. That requires asking hard questions about power and gender and the cost of empire. So the silence continues. The women remain nameless, and history moves on as if they never existed. But they did exist. They lived. They suffered. They endured. And they deserve to be remembered. You might be thinking, that was ancient history. Things are different now. We've evolved past treating people as property. Have we? Modern human trafficking moves approximately 25 million people annually, most of them women and children, many forced into sexual slavery. Mail-order bride industries operate in dozens of countries, women treated as products, raided, purchased, shipped to foreign lands where they have no support systems and no legal protections. Forced marriage persists in regions worldwide. Young girls married to older men to settle debts, establish alliances, or maintain family honor. Child marriage affects 12 million girls annually, children legally bound to adult men in systems that closely mirror ancient practices. The language has changed, the technology has evolved, but the fundamental pattern remains. Women traded as political tools, economic resources, or status symbols. Solomon's system of managing 1,000 wives isn't ancient history, it's a template that keeps getting reused, modified, updated for modern circumstances. The mega harem is gone, but the logic behind it, treating humans as leverage, using relationships as transactions, commodifying intimate connection for power, that logic persists. And until we confront the historical roots of these patterns, until we acknowledge what systems like Solomon's really were, we can't fully dismantle their modern equivalents. Solomon is called the wisest man who ever lived. God himself gave Solomon wisdom. The whole world came to hear his insights. But wisdom and ethics aren't the same thing. Intelligence and morality aren't identical. Solomon had the wisdom to create a political system that prevented war, generated wealth, and maintained power for 40 years. That's genius-level strategic thinking. But he lacked the moral imagination to see his wives as people, to recognize the cost of his system, to understand that peace built on suffering isn't really peace. Or maybe he did see it. Maybe he understood exactly what he was doing, and he chose the system anyway because it worked. That's almost worse. That's not ignorance. That's calculation. Ecclesiastes suggests Solomon knew the emptiness of it all, knew the meaninglessness of accumulating possessions, including human possessions, knew that his legendary wisdom hadn't made him good. I have seen all the things that are done under the sun. All of them are meaningless, a chasing after the wind. That's not the statement of a man who thinks he succeeded. That's the confession of someone who built a life he can't defend, who achieved everything and lost himself in the process. Solomon's tragedy wasn't that he failed. It's that he succeeded at building exactly what he intended to build, and then had to live inside it. The system that managed 1,000 wives also managed to destroy the man at its center. So what do we take from this? What does Solomon's story actually teach us? First, systems that treat people as tools eventually consume everyone involved. There's no such thing as humane dehumanization. You can't build a machine that processes humans and expect anyone to escape undamaged. Second, political expedience has moral costs that compound over time. Solomon's marriages prevented immediate wars, but created cultural and spiritual conflicts that lasted generations. Short-term solutions can become long-term catastrophes. Third, power without accountability is power without limits. Solomon could accumulate 1,000 wives because nobody could stop him. No system existed to say this is enough or this is wrong. Absolute power really does corrupt absolutely. Fourth, silence about suffering enables more suffering. The biblical silence about these women's experiences has made it easier for history to repeat similar patterns. What we don't name, we can't condemn. What we don't acknowledge, we can't prevent. Fifth, wisdom without compassion is just sophisticated cruelty. Solomon's intelligence made his system more efficient, not more ethical. Being smart doesn't make you good. Having answers doesn't mean you're asking the right questions. And finally, the people history forgets are often the ones who paid the highest price. Solomon's fame comes at the expense of 1,000 unnamed women. His glory is built on their erasure. Remembering them isn't just about historical accuracy. It's about acknowledging the full cost of the systems we admire, understanding who pays when empires rise, recognizing that behind every great king's achievement are people whose suffering made that achievement possible. Here's what they really don't want you to understand about King Solomon's 1,000 wives. It wasn't a romantic story. It wasn't even primarily about sex or lust. It was a calculated political system that used human beings as instruments of state policy. The women were treaty signatures, insurance policies, proof of alliance, living reminders to foreign kingdoms that attacking Israel meant harming their own daughters. The system worked exactly as designed. It kept Israel safe. It made Solomon wealthy. It prevented wars. By every political and economic metric, it succeeded brilliantly. And it was monstrous. Both things can be true. Solomon's harem was a political masterpiece and a humanitarian nightmare. It demonstrated genius-level strategic thinking and catastrophic moral failure. History wants to remember Solomon as wise, as blessed, as favored by God, the builder of the temple, the author of Proverbs, the man who ushered in Israel's golden age. But you can't separate that legacy from its foundation. You can't celebrate Solomon's achievements without acknowledging the 1,000 women whose lives fueled them. Some of those women were princesses who lived in relative comfort. Some were concubines who lived in isolation. Some never even met the man they were married to. Some bore his children. Some died alone and forgotten. All of them were trapped in a system they didn't create and couldn't escape. All of them paid the price for Solomon's political genius. All of them deserve to be remembered as more than a number in a list, more than a category in a database, more than obstacles to a king's spiritual journey. They were people. They lived. They mattered. And their story is finally being told. The next time someone mentions King Solomon's wisdom, think about the full picture. Think about what wisdom cost, who paid the price, what the system really looked like behind the sanitized biblical accounts. Think about the 16-year-old girl walking down that corridor in the opening scene, woman number 487, waiting for her one night, her one chance, her one moment to matter in a system designed to make her irrelevant. Think about her name, which nobody recorded, her thoughts, which nobody preserved, her life, which nobody honored. She was there, she was real, she was one of 1,000, and she deserves to be remembered. This is the true story of King Solomon's 1,000 wives, not how one man managed them all, but what it cost him and them to try. The wisest man who ever lived built a system so sophisticated it still echoes through history, so efficient it became a model for empires, so successful it destroyed everyone involved. That's the truth they don't teach in Sunday school. That's the story history tried to erase. Now you know. Now remember. Because the greatest tragedy isn't that Solomon had 1,000 wives, it's that we still don't know most of their names.